Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirk Cousins, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 13 waiver wire targets for the 2020 fantasy football season. On today's episode, of course, we're talking about all things related to the waiver wire and potentially picking up players at the running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, and defensive positions going into Week 13. We'll talk about players that not only could potentially help you this week in order to help clinch a playoff spot, or could potentially help you down the road as you might pick up handcuffs or players that are going to have better matchups during the fantasy football playoffs, weeks 14 through 16. Again, before we begin today's video, I want to thank you guys for the incredible support, helping us get to 35,000 subscribers. If you have not yet already, click that subscribe button, join the community. Again, we're making fantasy football content here on the daily for the entirety of the season. I wanted to also shout out Fantasy Pros. I did a waiver wire episode earlier today, so if you guys haven't checked them out, you can check them out here on YouTube or at their podcast, Fantasy Pros Podcast. Again, these guys are fantastic. I was a special guest on today's episode, so if you guys are interested, go check that out. Download their podcast and go check out their YouTube channel. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into this, shall we? We're talking about some waiver wire pickups, beginning with the running back position. This should be short and sweet. Again, there aren't a lot of incredible players to pick up. There aren't guys that had incredible breakout performances that must be owned going into this upcoming week, but there are a couple players that have had consistency of play, and of course, there are some players that are going to benefit due to injury. So, starting off as our number one, we have ourselves Devontae Booker of the Las Vegas Raiders. Considering the injury that took place to Josh Jacobs yesterday during that game against Atlanta, of course, the Raiders were a complete mess, fumbling left, right, and center. It did not matter. They were giving up the ball to the other team. As of right now, it seems to me that Josh Jacobs, according to all the news and information that I've been given, that he's dealing with an ankle injury. Is it a high ankle sprain? Is it a mild sprain? We don't know. We don't know if he's going to miss 1 week or potentially 3 weeks. But this definitely is going to help you, considering I don't think waivers will run until Wednesday night, Thursday morning, because again, there is still a Tuesday game to happen between the Steelers and the Baltimore Ravens. So again, you still have a couple days to figure out more information regarding this. At least see a Wednesday practice in order to get us more information regarding the matter. If in fact we see Josh Jacobs missing, they play against the New York Jets. I've talked about it at length. The New York Jets do give up a lot of points to opposing running backs, even though their run-stopping defense is one of the better in the National Football League, and they do like to send a lot of pressure at the opposing offensive line. I still think that Devontae Booker has a lot of upside if, in fact, Josh Jacobs is going to miss multiple weeks. Let's say, for example, it is a high ankle sprain. He misses, goes to the IR for 3 weeks. There is a potential that Devontae Booker, with the upcoming schedule of playing against the New York Jets this upcoming week, obviously in week 14, the first week of the fantasy football playoffs against Indianapolis, I'm not too excited about that. But then playing against the Los Angeles Chargers, they've given up a fair share of points to opposing running backs and good amount of yardage. In week 15, those are three decent matchups in which you could get a starting running back to play in. If you are a Josh Jacobs owner, this needs to be your highest priority. Just looking at what Devontae Booker's produced in the past. A couple weeks back against the Denver Broncos and the Los Angeles Chargers, in both those games combined, he had 3 rushing touchdowns and was averaging 6.21 yards per carry. So again, we've seen him be productive. We've seen this offense want to run the ball as consistently as they've had. Josh Jacobs, if he's going to miss time with the ankle injury, with, of course, Jalen Reagor potentially continuing to miss with the chest injury he missed this past week's game, this can be a 3-down back that is only owned in 9% of leagues, should be picked up this week, and that is why he's my number 1 running back. We move on to Frank Gore as our number 2. So Frank Gore at this moment in time has had a lot of consistency of play. Just this past Sunday against the Miami Dolphins. I know the Miami Dolphins, they do give up a lot of points on the ground to running backs, and that is something of consistency. And of course, this was a revenge game of sorts for Adam Gase and or Frank Gore. Both of them haven't played for the Miami Dolphins franchise just a couple years back, but Frank Gore, 18 carries, 74 rushing yards, 3 catches on 3 targets for 12 yards, had 10.1 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format, played 58% of the snaps. Of course, they still have Ty Johnson as the backup, with LaMichael Pirine still out with his injury. So if in fact we're going to continue to see LaMichael Pirine miss time, Frank Gore is definitely a fantasy football option you want to pick up, because again, in the last 2 weeks, he has been pretty productive and gotten a lot of touches. Just talking about the week before against the Los Angeles Chargers, he had 15 total rushing attempts for 61 yards, had himself a rushing touchdown, 2 targets, 2 receptions, and 10 receiving yards. That is 3 consecutive weeks in which he's had 2 or more receptions out of this backfield. In a half PPR, full PPR, he's continuing to create a base of potential volume. And to be honest, as long as he's touching the ball, 17, 20 times a game, regardless of the game script, he's going to get touches because of how much Adam Gase loves him. They want to continue to build on his legacy. I think Frank Gore is a number 2 option, especially if you need a running back right now with all the injuries taking place this upcoming week. Not a bad option against the Las Vegas Raiders. Again, they themselves give up a lot of points to running backs. My number 3 option is James White. And even though he's owned in 62% of leagues, I wanted to go ahead and mention him as of this moment in time because, again, James White is a running back that just a couple weeks back with Rex Burkhead going to the injured reserve, probably season-ending injury. He had himself 9 targets, 6 receptions, 64 receiving yards, and as a half PPR, full PPR connoisseur I mean, it seems like that is a player that I want on roster as a potential flex or RB2 option going forward. Now, just this past week, he only had 1 reception on 1 target for -1 yards. And though that may seem like, oh my God, James White probably had a 0 or negative point week, he still ended up with 14.2 fantasy points because he was the goal line back. On 5 carries, 18 rushing yards, he had 2 rushing touchdowns, 1 on a speed option and 1 on a toss to get to the pylon. James White seems to be the guy that is continuing to get more touches in this backfield as the weeks progress. Of course, they still have Damian Harris as the bell cow number 1, but with Sony Michel not getting any touches, even though being active this past week, it leads me to believe that James White going forward is going to get continued potential opportunity in this backfield. The Los Angeles Chargers, they've given up their fair share of not only receptions to opposing running backs, but yardage on the ground. This is a good matchup for them. The New England Patriots are on a streak, potentially trying to make the playoffs this year. I think James White, another good option to potentially pick up. We have Cam Akers as our number 4. And the reason I bring up Cam Akers isn't because, sure, he had himself a pretty good game, 14.4 fantasy points, if not the best game he's had in his rookie season. I'm a little concerned about it, of course, but the only reason you're going after Cam Akers is for the potential upside, the potential that he maybe wins this backfield, maybe somebody gets injured, or perhaps in the coming weeks when they play against Arizona, New England, the Jets, and Seattle, he can put together performances to at least give yourself a 10-point potential RB2, RB3 streaming option if in fact injuries or tough matchups plague you in the fantasy playoffs. So again, as of right now, Cam Akers only owned in 29% of Yahoo leagues as it pertains to his potential value. Of course, this past Sunday against the San Francisco 49ers, that is a tough run-stopping defense. They shut down Malcolm Brown. They shut down Darrell Henderson. But, of course, Cam Akers in the second half was the only running back to really get any total touches and or work in the game. He had a 61-yard long run. Of course, didn't get to the house, but the team rewarded him with a goal line opportunity, which led to a touchdown. 9 carries for 84 total yards and 1 rushing touchdown, making his entire week. Of course, if he had PPR upside, we'd have more value on him and potentially picking him up over these other prospects. But as of right now, with the uncertainty of this backfield, them kind of going with a hot hand approach, it just seems to me that Cam Akers is a guy that I kind of want to wait on and just continue to go with some other players. So we'll just put him at 4. We go with Ito Smith as our number 5. Ito Smith had a great performance. I mean, he chunked out majority of the work in this backfield, had more touches than Brian Hill, who had predominantly been named the guy that, hey, you know what, that's the guy that's going to be the heir to the throne of Todd Gurley in this Atlanta backfield, a guy that has seen work in the past for the Atlanta Falcons offense, of course, last season when Tevin Coleman had left, and of course, Devontae Freeman was dealing with injury. But Ito Smith came in, 12 carries, 65 yards, 1 rushing touchdown, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 10 receiving yards, and 15.5 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. As of right now, he's only owned in 1% of leagues, played 36% of the snaps. My only concern with Ito Smith is, yes, he got majority of the passing work, and that's great, and that's why I'm leaning with him instead of Brian Hill right now. But the upcoming matchups are horrible. New Orleans, then you have the Los Angeles Chargers in the first week of the fantasy playoffs. If in fact Gurley's still out by then, not a bad option. But then you have to play against Tampa Bay in week 15. 2 out of the next 3 matchups are incredibly tough. These are guys that I potentially want to avoid. But again, if you are a Todd Gurley owner and you need to have someone to at least fill his potential shoes if he is moved to the IR, you can go ahead and pick up Ito Smith. But I'm not going to ignore the fact that, of course, Brian Hill does exist. He still had himself 13 rushing attempts for 55 yards, and that's it. 1 target, 0 receptions, 0 touchdowns, 0 just 5.5 fantasy points. Played 50% of the snaps, owned in 47% of the leagues. A lot of people picked him up because they assumed, of course, that he would be the only guy in this backfield, considering we hadn't seen Ito Smith all season long, even though we saw sprinkles of Brian Hill. Unfortunately, this is the case. We're going to have to just continue to see what happens. For those of you who thought maybe Ito Smith got majority of his work in the second half, Ito Smith was running the ball in the first drive. Literally, in the beginning of the game, first quarter, on the first drive, was getting rushing attempts. So, again, I think this is going to be an RBBC situation, one that I don't like because of the upcoming potential matchups. But again, we mentioned Brian Hill and Ito Smith. Of course, I potentially prefer Ito Smith going forward purely based on PPR and half PPR formats and his receiving ability and our opportunity going forward. The last option I wanted to mention at the running back position is someone that's probably already on your league, but I want to mention him, J.K. Dobbins, mainly because, of course, J.K. Dobbins, I know he's on the COVID list and he's potentially going to miss this week and maybe even the following week. But when I look at the Ravens' upcoming schedule, I have a hard time thinking that, J.K. Dobbins is too far away from the potential of having a breakout performance. He was on pace to potentially be the starting running back of this team. I know we mentioned him last week as the number one. Then the information came out that, of course, he wasn't going to be able to play. But the last time we saw him play, 15 carries, 70 yards and a touchdown, 2 receptions on 2 targets, 15 yards against, a pretty good defense. I'm convinced that J.K. Dobbins, if and when he comes back, will be the lead back of this team. The last time we saw him play, he played 63% of the snaps, had 17 total touches in comparison to Gus Edwards having 3 and Mark Ingram having 2 in that singular game. So again, if he continues to lead all running backs in terms of snaps, which he's done since week 8, at the position, I think J.K. Dobbins is a guy that needs to continue to be rostered. I know many of you may have dropped him or potentially people in your league dropped him because of his, the fact that he's not going to play this week or potentially next week. I think if he plays against Dallas in the following week, we've seen Dallas give up a chunk of points to running backs. Dalvin Cook went for 160-1. Just Gibson this past week, Turkey Day, had 136-3. Kenyon Drake 164-2, and Gibson the first time they played against Dallas this year 128-1. So the Dallas Cowboys can't stop the run. If, in fact, J.K. Dobbins is back by then, I'm interested in potentially having him on my roster and for the rest of the fantasy football playoffs. But before we leave the running back position, I wanted to make this a point. First and foremost, we have to go ahead and pick up handcuff running backs. Handcuff running backs need to be selected and picked up immediately. If, in fact, players like Latavius Murray, Jamal Williams, Alexander Madison, first and foremost, are available. Carlos Hyde available in your leagues. They need to be picked up and paired with their blue chip running back, because if in fact you get to the fantasy football playoffs and you don't have enough fab by then, or you don't have the top waiver wire selection and something is to happen to your starting running back, you need to be available to at least have him on the bench to fill in immediately, because if in fact something crazy happens, Josh Jacobs just got hurt. We had a scare a little bit yesterday with Dalvin Cook. If your stud guy is to go down, you need to have the potential contingency plan to pivot away from them and go to their potential handcuff. Pick up your stud running back handcuffs immediately. Even if you don't own Dalvin Cook, pick up Alexander Madison. I don't really care, because I'd be willing to bet on Alexander Madison, because during the fantasy football playoffs, I don't need as much depth. I'd rather have the potential upside of not only stopping another player in my league from having him, or at least having the potential of maybe the league winning running back if something wrong is to happen. So again, we leave that as the contingency plan. We can go ahead and move on to the wide receiver position for week 13. Starting off with my number 1, we have Deebo Samuel. Now, I know he's probably owned in many of your leagues, but he was coming off an injury and is only owned in 55% of leagues. So he's probably, widely owned technically in 45% of leagues that still haven't been picked up in yet. So as of Yahoo, that's a pretty good, opportunity for you to go pick up Deebo Samuel. Had 13 targets, leading to 11 receptions, 133 receiving yards, and 18.8 fantasy points against my Los Angeles Rams. Of course, the Rams looked atrocious. Arm tackling, letting him just dominate and impose his will against the defense. It really just seemed to me like Deebo Samuel could do no wrong. And with Nick Mullins, of course, not having George Kittle out there and not really having a presence in terms of a receiving back, he really didn't have a check down king. He didn't have a security blanket to go to. Jordan Reed, he missed a couple times. Ross Dwelly not really pulling his weight. Too much more of a blocking tight end, specifically really put the hammer down on, Aaron Donald a couple of times yesterday. You can go find that on Twitter, I'm sure. Brian Boldinger posted that, just a nasty hit. But outside of that, I still think that Mullins is kind of looking towards him as a security blanket. If Brandon Ayuk comes back, of course, this offense gets better. And we know that Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk both have the opportunities to run the ball out of the backfield, a lot of jet sweep opportunities, a little bit of pitch pass stuff. It just seems to me that Deebo Samuel, if he's available, should be selected and picked up for sure. Michael Pittman Jr. is my number 2 option. Considering the fact that he had 9 targets this past week is fantastic. That's the most targets he's had in his entire rookie season. Just talking about the last 4 games in terms of his total targets. 7, 8, 3, and 9. In the last 2 out of the last 3 performances in which he had the 8 targets was against Tennessee. He had himself 7 catches, over 100 receiving yards. And in the game against the Green Bay Packers, he had 3 receptions on 3 targets and had himself a receiving touchdown, which made the week. Now, unfortunately, this past week, 9 targets only leading to 2 receptions and 28 receiving yards. It seems to me that, of course, there's a possibility that someone in your league, even though he's owned in 58% of leagues, might drop him. The fact that Michael Pittman Jr. is owned more than Deebo Samuel right now is just beyond me. But as of right now, if in fact Michael Pittman Jr. is going to be available, if someone drops him, the fact that they play against Houston, Las Vegas, and Houston in the next 3 consecutive weeks leads me to believe that there is an opportunity for you to pick this guy up and get some potential value out of him, as he is not only playing the most snaps amongst all wide receivers in the Indianapolis offense as of the last 3 weeks, but he's getting the most targets. So I know T.Y. Hilton scored. That's the first time he scored this season. And I think, of course, Phillip Rivers is going to be throwing the ball a little bit more against Houston as they only pass the ball. So it should be a higher scoring event back and forth. Should be an exciting one. Michael Pittman, a good option as our number 2 wide receiver. Number 3 is Corey Davis. We mentioned Corey Davis, only owned in 54% of leagues, had 3 targets, 3 receptions for 70 yards against the Indianapolis Colts. Those are 2 good performances against the Colts in 3 weeks. In my opinion, of course, A.J. Brown continued to shine, had himself an unbelievable performance. It had a kickoff return for a touchdown besides the reception for a touchdown. It just seems to me that Corey Davis, he's probably going to play behind A.J. Brown and Derrick Henry, of course, as the third fiddle of this offense, with Adam Humphries pretty much being irrelevant and Jonnu Smith in the next couple weeks maybe phasing out of this offense, getting less and less targets and less opportunity. So as of right now, I still think that Corey Davis, who has a lot of value, played 78% of the snaps, and since week 7, he is the number 16 overall wide receiver in a half PPR format. He is scoring about 10 points per week on average. Of course, I think that there's still a lot of value to be had here. As a wide receiver that has potential upside of a touchdown and continues to get relevant targets and work in the passing game, in an offense that has a fantastic schedule going forward, I really like Corey Davis. So he's my number 3 option. Number 4 is Sterling Shepard. And as it currently stands, I think Daniel Jones is potentially going to miss this upcoming week with Colt McCoy being the starting quarterback. That doesn't really 100% give Sterling Shepard incredible value, but Sterling Shepard's available in 52% of leagues right now. Played 78% of the offensive snaps this past week, in which he conducted and got himself 8 total targets for 7 receptions, 64 receiving yards, and 10.3 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. The thing that Sterling Shepard's been able to accomplish in the last 5 weeks since coming off the IR is fantastic. 40 total targets and had an 82.5% catch rate on those 40 targets. Has had 6 minimum receptions in each of the last 5 games. So in a full PPR, if he's going to catch the ball at least 6 times with accompanied at least 40, 50 yards, he's 10 points automatic. Going forward, playing against Seattle this week, an extremely advantageous matchup, the best at the wide receiver position. Obviously, if Daniel Jones ends up playing, he did have an MRI on his hamstring, should potentially be able to play this week, but I doubt that they'll let him go. I think Colt McCoy still has the opportunity to send the ball in Sterling Shepard's direction. When Colt McCoy came into the game this past Sunday, Golden Tate did get himself, I think, 3 or 4 targets, but Sterling Shepard did lead the team with the majority of the targets if and when Colt McCoy came into the game. So with Darius Slayton pretty much invisible, it just seems to me that Sterling Shepard, a fantastic option as our number 4 wide receiver this week. The number 5 wide receiver is a guy that's probably owned in, or not even owned in very many leagues. As of right now, only owned in 29% of Yahoo leagues. Jalen Reagor is the guy that you should have picked up. And if you are watching this right now before the game, pick him up, because I know many leagues, you can go ahead and pick up players off waivers like they're free agents, and you can drop someone off your bench. Pick him up before the game starts tonight, because again, if in fact you're able to do so, this is a player that in the last 3 weeks has had 18 targets. Travis Fulgham, their number 1 wide receiver, has had 19 targets in those 3 games. Unfortunately, Travis Fulgham has fallen out of favor because even though he's getting targets, he's only had 2 receptions in his last 2 performances, 1 each. I think as of right now, Jalen Reagor playing against the Seattle Seahawks tonight is going to be a great play. But going forward after tonight's breakout performance, could be a fantastic fantasy football prospect and potentially the number 1 wide receiver of the Philadelphia Eagles. There's a reason why they drafted him as high as they did in the 2020 NFL draft. And there's a reason why going forward, as all these rookie wide receivers like Pittman or Denzel Mims are doing as of late, they're getting more and more opportunity, and it's leading to their success, even though they were late bloomers in their rookie season. I think Jalen Reagor, because of the injury, held him out. Didn't have as much experience, but going forward could be a fantastic, viable option for the rest of the season. And the last wide receiver I wanted to mention is Nelson Agholor. Now, he's only owned in 43% of leagues. This is the reason why I wanted to mention him. First and foremost, he is an every other week kind of guy. This upcoming week, if they do not have Josh Jacobs, the reason why I want to mention Nelson Agholor is because they'll probably have to pass the ball more than people anticipate. The Jets do have a good, run-stopping defense, even though they give up touchdowns to opposing running backs. And I'm sure Devontae Booker can fall into the end zone, but if Derek Carr wants to succeed and take this 6-4 Raiders team to the playoffs, they have to beat teams and dominate teams like the New York Jets, and they'll be able to do so. As of right now, Nelson Agholor, every other week for the last, 4 or 5 weeks, has scored a touchdown. This upcoming week should be the week. Playing against the New York Jets, this last week coming off of a performance in which he only had 5 catches for 54 yards, 0 touchdowns, but again, 7.9 points. If he accompanies a performance like that, in the last 2 weeks, he's had a total of 15 targets. If he accompanies a performance like 5 catches, 54 yards with a touchdown, he makes himself an automatic wide receiver too. And I think because of the matchup, because of the potential of course, Derek Carr having to throw the ball more without a stable running back and or offensive line, Nelson Agholor, not a bad option this upcoming week. We move on to the tight end position. We begin with Robert Tonyan. So as of right now, again, Robert Tonyan only owned in 61% of leagues, probably already been picked up in your league, but I wanted to mention him. 5 targets, 5 receptions, 67 receiving yards, and a touchdown against Chicago. We mentioned it before. Chicago gives up a lot of points to opposing tight ends. That is a fact. TJ Hawkinson this week, gonna feast. Because again, that offense outside of TJ Hawkinson, maybe if Galladay comes back and DeAndre Swift, those are the only threats that I want to at least participate in starting in my roster. So as of right now, Robert Tonyan plays against the Philadelphia Eagles this upcoming week. Of course, he's coming off a fantastic performance against the Chicago Bears on Sunday Night Football. The week before against Indianapolis, 5 catches, 44 yards, and a touchdown. So he's had 2 consecutive weeks of a touchdown. That's 7 touchdowns this season alone. So again, Robert Tonyan, not a bad option if in fact he is still available in your league. We have Mike Gesicki as our number 2, owned in 62% of leagues. Again, with Ryan Fitzpatrick at the quarterback position, Mike Gesicki is a different quarterback. Of course, Adam Shaheen did score a touchdown, and there's always the potential of, I guess you could say tight end scoring and stealing touchdowns from a guy like Gesicki, but he had 2 catches, 35 yards, a red zone target that led to a touchdown early in that game. Plays against the Cincinnati Bengals this week, giving up the 5th most points to opposing tight ends. Evan Ingram just had a game against them. Unfortunately, did fumble, but if he had not fumbled there, he would have had 7 catches for 150, to be honest. But he had 6 for 129. I think overall, Mike Gesicki is going to be the number 1 potential tight end on this team, the number 2 target, with, of course, Preston Williams out and Devontae Parker being the number 1. If Myles Gaskin comes back, he'll maybe be the number 2 target, but down in the red zone, Ryan Fitzpatrick continues to look towards Gesicki's way. We have number 3, Kyle Rudolph. If in fact Irv Smith's going to continue to miss time, I think Kyle Rudolph, just off of this past week's performance, has proven that he is a viable tight end option. 8 total targets, 7 receptions, 68 yards for 10.3 fantasy points. A fantastic performance on a guy that's only owned in 14% of fantasy leagues right now. Plays against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Just to give you some context, since week 2, the Jacksonville Jaguars have given up 9 total receiving touchdowns to opposing tight ends. So if you want to take advantage of this matchup, I mean, go for it. Because again, if you're missing Gronk, maybe you have a bye week because the Carolina Panthers and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are out this week, you could go ahead and swap in Kyle Rudolph for the matchup. Now, outside of Kyle Rudolph, we have ourselves Jordan Reed. We know Jordan Reed's fantastic. But as of right now, the way I see it, if in fact he doesn't get his, a little bit more targets, more opportunity, it's not going to be great for him. But he plays against Buffalo. Buffalo gives up the 3rd most points to opposing tight ends this season. Of course, Hunter Henry coming off a great performance against them, and many other players have scored a consistent amount of opportunity points against them. So I think Jordan Reed, another fantastic option, only owned in 25% of leagues. We move on to Trey Burton. I know he had 6 targets, leading to 3 receptions, 42 receiving yards, and a touchdown for 11.7 points, and plays against Houston, Las Vegas, and Houston in the next 3 weeks, which should be advantageous matchups as those defenses aren't the best in the National Football League. But let me go ahead and just throw out this potential caveat. He had all of his production and points in the first half of the game. That scares me. With the fact that Mo Alley-Cox is still in the game, playing majority of the snaps, we still have Jack Doyle stealing touchdowns, and of course, we still have a plethora of running backs, and Jacoby Brissett coming in and stealing touchdowns. It just leads me to believe that Trey Burton is not as trustable, but a streaming option nonetheless this upcoming week. We have Logan Thomas as our last option. Of course, he scored this past week against the Dallas Cowboys. Everyone does. So again, it's a matter of matchup. But this upcoming week, his matchup is awful. He plays against Pittsburgh. They give up the fewest amount of points to opposing tight ends this season. I know Logan Thomas has had his fair share of opportunity here and there in terms of points. Maybe he gets lucky this week. I doubt it. He ended up throwing a pass this last week, which is very interesting. But either way, they're trying to get him more and more involved. If in fact he ends up getting a decent, game out of this, then that'll be fine. But the only reason you'd honestly pick up Logan Thomas is for the future in his playoff matchups, not this Pittsburgh one in Week 13. We move on to the quarterback position, and we begin with our number 1, Kirk Cousins. And Kirk Cousins is our number 1 specifically because I think, of course, he's had himself pretty good games as of late. 40% owned as of right now in Yahoo formats, coming off of a game of 307 passing yards and 3 passing touchdowns, 19 rushing yards. They were down 11 points against the Carolina Panthers in the 4th quarter, and boy did he will his team back without Adam Thielen in the lineup, and of course a shaky Dalvin Cook late in that game. In 3 out of the last 4 games, Kirk Cousins had 3+ touchdowns in the passing game. If he continues to throw the ball at a consistent level like he has, he's going to continue to at least gain favor from myself. In this upcoming week's matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars, Kirk Cousins, an automatic pickup and play in my eyes, of course, if you are a Teddy Bridgewater owner and or a Tom Brady owner. If you want to go ahead and avoid guys like Derek Carr or Taysom Hill or something of that extent, maybe you want to avoid a quarterback. Matt Ryan struggled against New Orleans last time he played against them, might not have Julio again. Then I think Kirk Cousins, not a bad streaming option this upcoming week. We move on to our next streaming quarterback. It is Ryan Fitzpatrick. Again, with Tua potentially out, I think he's a fantastic pickup. If in fact we get confirmation that Tua is out, then you can go ahead and fully pick him up. He's probably available in majority of leagues. He's only owned in 20% of leagues, coming off a 257 passing yard game, 2 passing touchdowns, 10 rushing yards, plays against the Cincinnati Bengals. Again, a lot of people don't really realize this, but from weeks 2 through 6 of this season alone, he was the number 6 overall quarterback in a 4-point per passing touchdown format. So we know what he's capable of. We know that he's got the ability to just sling it, not give a F, and just really get after it and score points, whether it's on the ground or through the air. So as long as you get this guy the opportunity, he's going to lead this team to success. I think this is a W for the team, and that's obviously because he's going to lead them there with a potential couple touchdowns. We have ourselves Taysom Hill as our number 3. He's owned in 59% of leagues. Should have already been picked up. The fact that he only had 78 passing yards, 9 for 16 passing, he's continuing to feed into the idea that he is Cam Newton. He is just, the Cam Newton of the New Orleans Saints. He pretty much is that. He had 44 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns. That's back-to-back weeks with over 44 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. That's where his value is pretty much capped at. You're getting yourself 12 points off the 2 touchdowns, and you're getting yourself 4.4 plus in terms of rushing yards. His 78 passing yards in comparison to 233 the week before is struggle. It's a little bit of a struggle, especially against Denver, who didn't have much of a defense in the last couple of weeks. But again, this quarterback didn't really have to pass the ball very much, per se, in the game. Plays against Atlanta again this week. He had himself a fantastic performance against them a couple weeks back. Could once again do it this week. We have ourselves Derek Carr. I understand Derek Carr, he had one of the worst, maybe one of the worst all-time performances I've ever seen in terms of fumbling the ball. But as of right now, he plays against the New York Jets. I can assure you that Derek Carr is not a top-tier quarterback, but based on the matchup and based on the opportunity in which they're going to have to at least prove to people that they're still one of the better teams. They're a team that has beaten Kansas City this year. They got to come out and they got to prove to themselves and to everyone else that they're still a playoff potential team. And I think Derek Carr, who's had bounce back games in the past, should be able to do so. Phillip Rivers is my number 5. I know Phillip Rivers is kind of down in the dumps right now, considering Jacoby Brissett stole 2 one-yard touchdowns from him on the goal line this past week. I just kind of attribute that to potentially, stealing from the running backs. But again, it could have been Rivers flying in there. I don't think he could. He's an old man. 295 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. Still ended up having a great performance, even though his passing completion percentage was near the 50s. This upcoming week plays against Houston. Then he goes against Las Vegas, then Houston again. Those are 3 consecutive matchups in which I like, and Phillip Rivers could end up doing some damage against some defenses. The last option we want to mention is Mitch Trubisky. Matt Nagy's already come out and said Trubisky's going to be the starter. I want to go ahead and double down on this and say that Mitchell Trubisky should potentially be picked up and played this week, only owned in 35% of leagues, and this is why. Mitch Trubisky's coming off of a game in which he had 242 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 11 rushing yards, and though he turned over the ball twice through the air with 2 interceptions, I'm not worried about it because he takes on the Detroit Lions. The Detroit Lions and Mitch Trubisky have a fine history, and Trubisky's always been on the right side of said history. In the last 3 contests against the Lions, he has had, and I quote, 9 passing touchdowns. Earlier this year, in week 1, 242 and 3 against Detroit. Last season, in the 2 contests combined, 511 passing yards, 6 passing touchdowns, and only 1 interception. Mitchell Trubisky against the Lions is an automatic in my eyes, and the guy that I wanted to mention to make sure you guys know. We move on to the last segment of today's show in which we talk about defensive streaming options and defenses that you may need to go ahead and pick up for the fantasy football playoffs going forward. This upcoming week, if in fact the Kansas City Chiefs are available, they are an automatic pickup and play as they play against the Denver Broncos and then the following week against Miami. If in fact by week 14, Tua Tagovailoa is the starting quarterback of the Miami Dolphins, that is even better for the Kansas City Chiefs defense, as that quarterback is not as trustworthy as a Fitzpatrick in terms of performances. But a fun fact I wanted to mention, the last time Fitzpatrick played against the Kansas City Chiefs back in 2016 when he was a New York Jet, he threw 6 interceptions. So just putting it out there, Chiefs for the next 2 weeks should be decent play. The Seattle Seahawks, of course they play tonight against the Philadelphia Eagles and they might end up getting torched, but their upcoming schedule, the New York Giants, the New York Jets, the Washington football team. Those are scheduled games that I honestly want to take advantage of. And if in fact this defense can turn it around and their secondary can shore up more or cause more, turnovers potentially, could be a great option. We move on to our number 3. We have ourselves the Cleveland Browns. So as of right now, I've mentioned it before. I know they play against Tennessee and I don't want to take care of it in terms of the matchup right now. I want the Cleveland Browns for weeks 15 and 16. Pick them up, roster 2 defenses if you have to. But those are the matchups I want to take care of. I think they're owned in 72% of leagues, more than the Chiefs and the Seahawks. But again, an option that you could potentially roll with going forward. The Raiders. If you are looking for purely the best defense to play this week, it's anybody versus the Jets. And as of right now, the Raiders have the privilege of doing so. They just got their teeth kicked in, and they just got dog-walked by the Atlanta Falcons. I think the Raiders, of course, could have a bounce-back game here and prove to Adam Gase that he still sucks. Moving on, the last couple options, the Arizona Cardinals coming off of a pretty good defensive performance, only owning 21% of leagues, plays against the Los Angeles Rams this week. We know Goff throws interceptions. He does that for a living. As a Rams fan, I'm aware, purely aware of it. Then they play against the New York Giants, the Philadelphia Eagles, and the 49ers. I think they have a pretty solid schedule. I know their defense has given up points as of late, but they could cause some turnovers, could send some pressure. If they had Chandler Jones this year, my goodness, would they be fantastic as a defense. But either way, I think Arizona is not a bad option. The last option I wanted to mention is the potential Packers this week, playing against Philadelphia. If Philadelphia comes out and is lackluster against Seattle and gets punished, I want to continue to double down on that potential, playing the Packers against them. The only other defense that I wanted to mention is the Panthers. They come off of the bye week in week 14 playing against Denver. Not a bad option. Those are our waiver wire targets for week 13 of the 2020 fantasy football season. Thank you everybody for watching. Make sure you subscribe, click the like button down below. I really do appreciate the support. The Discord link is down in the description of the video. The Patreon down there for those of you looking to get all of your 2020 fantasy football questions answered and extra content. Thank you everybody for watching. Tomorrow we'll talk about running back rankings, and until then, I'll see you guys. Peace.